On November 5th, 2015, news broke that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had updated its policies regarding LGBTQ members. It was one of the most consequential and notorious policy updates that is necessary to understand the modern LDS Church. Many people can identify where they were when they heard news regarding this policy. I certainly can. While I was teaching at the University of Missouri that year, I was actually in Utah about to speak at a conference at Utah Valley University. I was sitting around a restaurant table with a number of friends when news started trickling in, and all we could do was scan through our phones, not believing that it was real. Now, a quick summary of the policy was twofold. First, regarding those who entered into same-sex marriages, they were now regarded as in a state of apostasy, a position that would typically mean that they could be excommunicated, or to use modern LDS language, their membership could be revoked. And second, that children of LGBTQ marriages would not be allowed to be blessed as a child, baptized at the age of 8, or in the cases of young men, ordained to the priesthood in their teenage years. Indeed, those children could not receive access to those salvific rites until they turned 18 and renounced their parents' relationship. This policy was later repealed, or at least revised a few years later, but many of those scars remain, and that moment, I argue, is one of the most important points to understand the modern LDS Church for reasons I'll get into. This month, I'm recording this video in November 2025, marks the 10-year anniversary of that policy. And while the impact and the reactions are still fresh and that pain can still be felt by many, we can start to place that policy within its broader historical context, which is what I hope to do in this video. By the way, look forward to an issue in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, their spring 2026 issue that will be devoted to this topic with a number of scholars, including myself, as well as a number of LGBTQ members, reflecting on the policy, its legacy, and its context. That will be coming out, and don't worry, I'll give a shout out when that issue is available. I have several goals for this video, however. First, I want to provide some historical context for exclusion policies in the LDS Church that were then incorporated into this LGBTQ policy. It's these policies of exclusion, especially over questions of gender and the family. Then I want to talk about the immediate context for the 2015 policy and what we know about its creation and its meaning. Then I'm going to talk about the immediate reaction and the reception. Then I'll talk about its eventual reversal and the meanings that we can take from that. And then finally, I'll talk about some of the lasting legacies. And at the end of the video, I'll also get into a bit of my own personal background with this, because like many, this policy directly impacted me and my relationship to the LDS institution. Before I jump into today's topic, though, I do want to share the great news and express my deep gratitude for this channel passing the 10,000 subscriber number, a figure that I did not think was possible, especially in its first year. I'm so grateful for those of you who find my videos useful, and I hope I will continue to produce content that you enjoy. As I approach that 10,000 subscription mark, I asked followers what we should do to celebrate, and the most common response was a book giveaway. So I am indeed going to be giving a giveaway of one of my books, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, and I will sign it if the winner likes that. And the way that you can enter the book giveaway is I just started a new newsletter with Kit, here you see as the home page, which I will be sending out infrequent, maybe bi-weekly emails that provide links to all the videos I've done in the last couple weeks over my different platforms, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, when I'm interviewed or when there's upcoming events. All of that is just meant to corral material that I'm already doing. So if you go to that Kit newsletter, I will include a link in the video description, and sign up. You will be entered into the drawing for the free book. But again, I'm so grateful that so many of you have found this channel useful. If you haven't yet, please make sure to subscribe. We can get get to the next milestone quicker that way. And if you want to give back, I generally appreciate those who have become members and enable us to keep putting in time into this video. All right, let's get back to the topic at hand. The LDS Church has a long history of exclusion that predated the November 2015 policies, several of which were then incorporated into those new restrictions. So we need to understand that history. It's not a surprise for you to hear me say that this context and this history gives meaning and background to understand these modern events. Now, there are two movements that the LDS Church responded to that really framed the way they deal with those that they consider insidious invasions into the church: fundamentalism and feminism. I'm going to start with fundamentalism. In the 1920s and 1930s, there was a growing underground fundamentalist movement in Utah where many Latter-day Saints believed the church was wrong when it gave up polygamy, at least publicly, in 1890, and then for real a couple decades later. And they believed that they were restoring the church to its true foundations. And by the 1930s, LDS leaders, especially J. Reuben Clark, who joined the First Presidency in 1933, wanted to do all they could to root out these fundamentalists within their communities. They tried to excommunicate them. They tried to get them to sign loyalty oaths. They would work with police to try to get them arrested. And then in 1935, the presiding bishopric sent out new instructions on what to do with these members. And this is an important policy that I promise will directly connect to the November 2015 policy. And it's a big block quote, so I'll put the quote up on the screen. Quote, "We advise that the children of men and women who have been excommunicated from the church because of their having entered into illicit relations under the guise of plural marriage be not baptized until they have sufficient understanding to apply intelligently for baptism and can give assurance that they accept the teachings and doctrines of the church and express regret for the opposition manifested by their parents to the rules of the church. There is no consistency in baptizing a child and having him re-enter a home, the spirit of which is an antagonistic to the authorities of the church and out of harmony with its principles." Close quote. You can see there some of the foundations of a policy that will later be appropriated for other contexts. That policy is then officially added to the church handbook in 1940, and then it's revised in 1960 to give LDS leaders a bit more flexibility in dealing with these members. Eventually, it becomes codified as 18 years old as a mark where these children can apply for a baptism so long as they renounce their parents' polygamous relationship. Notably, that policy is still in place today, even while the LGBTQ policy is reversed. The other movement that the church tries to consolidate its boundaries against was feminism in the 1970s through the 1990s. And this comes in the wake of the post-World War II era in which the LDS Church sacralizes the notion of the traditional family, with what they call traditional gender roles in place. But as American society awakens to the new movement toward gender equality, there were many within the LDS Church who framed feminism in a way that they believed was both faithful to the LDS tradition, but also responsive to a new age with new expectations, especially for women. You see this with the creation of Exponent 2 magazine, the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, the postulations of a female divinity, and even some women who pushed for women's ordination. All of those movements worried LDS leaders who feared that the traditional family was crumbling and did all they could to reaffirm those boundaries, which resulted in the 1980s and the 1990s a string of excommunications of those who were found in a state of, quote, apostasy, which meant that they were challenging those traditional gender roles. Most famously, of course, with the September 6th in 1993, where 6 prominent LDS intellectuals were disciplined in a coordinated disciplinary measure, but it did not stop with those 6. There were many others during that decade. And what you see from these histories and how the church instituted policies to deal with children in fundamentalist families and to categorize those challenging traditional boundaries as in apostasy is a blueprint for how the church would then deal with others who challenge those boundaries later on. Just as the September 6th disciplinary proceedings took place and as other LDS feminists were punished in the 1990s, the church was also redirecting much of its attention to the new battleground, which was on gay marriage. In the 1980s, Dallin H. Oakes, a newly added member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, dictated for the church through an important memo that I've discussed in previous videos that this should be the new frontier through which they focus a lot of their attention. Now, Hawaii was the first state in which they directly intervened to preserve what they defined as traditional marriage, but it did not stop there. And soon they were involved in many states across the United States in trying to pass amendments or oppose propositions that would have legalized gay marriage. Prop 8 in 2008 in California is, of course, the most prominent example, especially since those who opposed gay marriage won, and the LDS Church ended up being blamed in popular culture. And Proposition 8 in 2008 was the final state victory for the anti-gay marriage forces. In fact, in Utah itself, in December 2013, gay marriage became legal when the Supreme Court Justice ruled that barring gay marriage was an infringement on the rights of the citizens based on the Utah Constitution. Now, as states started legalizing gay marriage, it then became time for it to have a national law, which is why in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled in the Obergefell decision, the summer of 2015, which legalized gay marriage nationwide. And that changed the game. That restructured how many communities are going to respond to this issue. Now, on the one side, there are many who saw hope in this development, that finally, now that gay marriage is accepted, maybe many traditions will be more accepting of it. And in fact, Affirmation, which is the LGBTQ Mormon organization dating back till 1977, they charted this as a period of inclusion and optimism and positive change. There are many gay couples who were starting to attend church believing that they would be welcome. This is a time when Mormons building bridges were a common feature at a number of parades, including in Utah. But while there are some within the church who hope that this augured a new era, many institutions, including, it turns out, the LDS Church itself, believe that it was time to redouble their efforts and to retrench back to redefining internal boundaries, that they lost the external battle over defining the boundaries of law, but now they are going to reassert their control over the internal boundaries over who gets to belong. And it's within that context that these new anti-LGBTQ policies were introduced in the fall of 2015. Now, we may likely never know the internal dynamics. We don't have access to those primary sources, and in fact, it's been said that many LDS leaders are now told not to keep those records, like we have of previous apostolic eras where we have lots of records to capture these internal dynamics. LDS apostles in the First Presidency today now emphasize their unanimity in decisions and the harmony rather than disagreements. But there are some, let's call them red flags, when it comes to the origins of this LGBTQ policy that was made known in November 2015. Greg Prince, the wonderful historian who's written a number of books, including Gay Rights in the LDS Church, has had access to oral histories. And he has offered, and I want to emphasize that this is speculation because I do not have access to sources that confirm this, that it was Russell M. Nelson, then the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, who pushed forward this policy, got Thomas S. Monson, who was then the LDS president, but was not in the best of health, to sign off in a very quick fashion that lacked the typical long period of deliberation and debate within church leadership, to the point to where when it was implemented, there are many church leaders who were caught by surprise. So I think it's important to at least capture some of the important elements of this policy. It was framed when it was introduced as a reaffirmation of the church's stance on marriage between man and a woman, denouncing gay marriage as a corruption of that practice, that those who therefore enter into same-sex marriage, even though it is now legal, are considered in a state of apostasy. And in order to maintain those boundaries, that the children of those same-sex couples would be deprived of blessings, baptism, and ordination until the age of 18, when they would be asked to renounce their parents. You can see how that is directly reliant on those traditions and backgrounds on how the church had dealt with fundamentalist Mormons and the radical feminist movement, now implemented in this new way. Now, regardless of whatever the background was to the policy's creation, it did catch many by surprise, and the implementation seemed rushed. It just appeared as a new update to the leadership handbook. And as soon as some people saw this update and recognized the significance, they leaked it out to reporters and journalists, and that's how it became news. It didn't become news through a newsroom statement from the church. It became news because church leaders, looking at their phones, seeing the handbook, saw this update, and then let it be known. Now, the newsroom rushed out a conversation with the Apostle D. Todd Christofferson the very next day. Why D. Todd Christofferson? Well, he had a similar legal background. He had spoken up on these public issues before. And notably, he had a brother, Tom Christofferson, who was quite famous for being an LGBTQ Mormon trying to carve out space. So that was the background. I think it's clear, even if we don't know the internal dynamics, that there were some debate going on, and the execution felt extraordinarily rushed for a church that's typically very polished in how it introduces things. It would be hard to overstate how overwhelming the response was to these policies with regard to the backlash. There are many who were frankly shocked at what they saw, could not believe the draconian measures, especially the depriving of children of these salvific ordinances and these rituals that are at the heart of the church. Many immediately started pronouncing that they were leaving the church. There were mass resignations. In fact, at one public mass resignation event that took place a little over a week later, on November 15th, 2015, 1,500 people formally resigned. There is a website established to streamline the process for those who wanted to remove their names from the records. And we'll never fully know the extent of those numbers, even if the LDS Church has those numbers at finger's reach. It also directly impacted a lot of families in a way that was a direct result of what the church itself had introduced in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. Whenever LGBTQ men in particular would come out to their leaders and say that they identify as LGBTQ, one of the most common pieces of advice was, well, go ahead and get married to a woman, and that's how you are going to solve that crisis. They would try that, they would have kids, it wouldn't work out, and often there would then be a divorce, and then that man, or in the other cases women, would go forward and have new relationships. Well, what happens to their children? Because now their children are the direct victims of this new policy. Now, one of the leaders of affirmation at the time was a guy named Nathan Kitchen, a phenomenal individual who wrote a great and moving memoir titled The Bows of Love that I strongly recommend. In that memoir, he narrates about what it was like to be leading affirmation at the time and the struggle that many members saw, because there were baptisms that had to be placed on hold for these children due to these new policies. And Nathan Kitchen reports that there were a number of queer members of the church who were being forced to sign new divorce agreements or new custody arrangements from their straight spouses to enable their children to be baptized. That's the type of on-the-ground strain that was forced as a result of these revisions to the church's guidelines. And LGBTQ groups adapted from, in the years leading up, that this hope for integration and optimism now moved from shifting from pushing for inclusion to just trauma and recovery, no longer seeing a positive future for many of their members within the LDS Church. Now, LDS leaders recognized some of these problems very early on. This is where the rushed nature of the policy comes in, especially when you have so many of these families that were encouraged to be married, even though they were of mixed orientation. And now there's a question of what to do with their children when one of these parents are now in a same-sex relationship. Well, they came up with the revision just a few months later in January 2016 that allowed more flexibility for what children would do in those circumstances if they had a straight set of parents and then a queer set of parents. And it's in that context that Russell M. Nelson made this statement that still causes a lot of harm in some circles, reaffirmation in others, but I think it's significant enough to the story to share it in full. So here you get the block quote. This is what Nelson said in 2016. "We met repeatedly in the temple and fasting and prayer and sought further direction and inspiration. And then when the Lord inspired his prophet, President Thomas S. Monson, to declare the mind of the Lord and the will of the Lord, each of us during that sacred moment felt a spiritual confirmation. It was our privilege as apostles to sustain what had been revealed to President Monson. Revelation from the Lord to his servants is a sacred process." Now, many have heard that story and the reference to the policy as revelation, and they think that's directly referring to the November 5th, 2015 policy, where if you actually read it in context and know some of the background, he is actually talking there about the revision to that policy, which I don't think lessens the pain of how leaders saw this with regard to LGBTQ members, seeing the pain and having such a harmful practice being called revelation. But I think it's important to get that historical chronology right. And that kind of put the church in a more manageable but still hurtful position with regard to LGBTQ families. But it very quickly became apparent that the policy was unsustainable. Many LDS families, probably a majority of LDS families, were impacted in some way because nowadays nearly every family has some connection to an LGBTQ member. And the younger generation, even those who do not identify as queer, are much less willing to accept these types of boundaries. And so the impossibility of enforcing and getting Latter-day Saint members to buy on represented the limits of prophetic control in the modern society, which ended up culminating in April 2019 at an LDS leadership gathering when the church announced that they were reversing those policies and moving back to the status of pre-November 2015. And one thing that I find really significant about that reversal is that they admitted that it was due to this external pressure. Dallin H. Oakes provided a quote saying, "We want to reduce the hate and contention so common today." It is not that common for LDS leaders to announce that we're changing these policies because we recognize that they're doing harm. But they did that with these November policies. And Nelson, speaking to BYU a few months later, Nelson is by that point the LDS president, claimed that just as the origins of the policy were rooted in love, their rescission is also recognized as a form of love. Because, and I think this is significant, lots of people focus justifiably to his claim that the policy originated in love. But I also think it's important to note that in that same address, he marked that he recognized that the policies caused harm, which led the LDS leaders to grieve. Again, another concession recognizing the limits of what the prophets can implement in the modern church, especially when there is such a disconnect of societal expectations, lived realities, and these priesthood directions. And long after the policy was reversed in April 2019, the scars remained. But that reversal was a symbol of this concession to new circumstances, even if many still could not find a way to remain within the faith. Now, I teased at the start of the video that I would bring in a bit of my own personal experience, and it's not going to be too much. I promise I'm not going to distract, but I will note that I distinctly remember sitting at a table at Slab Pizza in Provo, Utah. Those of you who are familiar with the place know how great that place is. Surrounded by many fellow scholars and friends about to participate in this conference at Utah Valley University. And scrolling through my phone and looking at these updates and being absolutely dumbfounded because to a great extent, that policy seemed unfathomable to me, which, of course, demonstrates a degree of blind spots because a similar policy had been in place and remains in place for fundamentalist Mormons. But I could not have conceived of LDS leaders implementing such a policy. And further, I could not conceive of my fellow Latter-day Saints defending the policy and admitting. Now, as I mentioned, not everyone did. In fact, many opposed it. But the extent to which many Latter-day Saints, who I recognized as fellow congregants, were willing to defend the policy shook me. And it really damaged my perception of a relationship with members and the institution. And I think that experience is quite common because I've heard from many that November 2015 policy fundamentally shifted their relationship to the LDS Church, even when that policy was reversed several years later. Now, this history that I tried to provide in this video, I want to emphasize, this history does not lessen that pain. But I hope it does provide some understanding, and I hope it does provide some context and help us understand the significance. Because I think this story of the November 2015 policy is one of the most important stories through which to understand the modern LDS Church. It emphasizes both the anxiety on the part of the church to maintain what they see as traditional boundaries, but the impossibility to do so in the modern institution. That tension between those two continue even today. Even just a couple of years ago in 2023, when the LDS Church introduces policies regarding transgender members, is just the latest example of this long history of exclusion and this confrontation of modern expectations and ecclesiastical realities. And I also want to emphasize, in talking about this history, it is good to talk about the institution and institutional policies. And if you want to learn more about the institutional policies, as much as we know about them, I strongly recommend Gregory Prince's book that I referenced earlier, Gay Rights and the Mormon Church. But I think it's also important to center the voices of LGBTQ Mormons and how they experienced it and the pain it caused for them. And I just want to highlight two volumes, one that I've already mentioned before, Nathan Kitchen's The Bows of Love, a memoir published by Common Consent Press. But I also want to give a shout out to a wonderful compilation of essays by Carrie Spencer Prey and Jen Lee Smith titled I Spoke to You in Silence, which was published by the University of Utah Press, that includes several searing accounts of queer Latter-day Saints struggling to react to and adapt to the world that those November 2015 policies implemented. If you remember where you were when you heard, and please share it in the comments because I'm interested, because I really think that in some ways, this November 2015 policy is the inverse of the 1978 racial restriction ending, where everyone will talk about how they knew exactly where, or they remember exactly where they were when Spencer W. Kimball ended the priesthood and temple ban, and they pulled over to the side of the road and cried. I think the inverse is true with the November 2015 policy, that many people remember where they were, and they might have been crying, but for a different reason. I hope this story demonstrates why history continues to be relevant and has indeed never been more relevant than it is today, because it allows us to place these stories in context, even if it doesn't soften the pain. I hope you found this video useful. If so, please hit the like button, share it with others, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. I am so grateful for the audience that this channel has built so far, and I'm looking forward to digging into these topics going forward.